during session. Remote access will be allowed to all meetings for the interim. Members will provide the information prior to the meeting on how to access the meeting remotely. The meeting materials were put online earlier this week and made available for downloading. At this time, we'll have Amy call the roll. Members, please need to indicate whether you are present in person, remote from home, or remote from your annex office. Amy?
Senator Embry,
Present.
Senator Neal, Senator Turner,
Here.
Senator Wilson,
Here.
Representative Banta,
Here.
Representative Bojanowski,
Here.
Representative Bridges,
Here.
Representative Fisher, Representative Flood, Representative Glenn,
Representative Flood is here and at home. Is present and at home.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative Howard,
Here.
Representative Massey, Representative McCool,
Here.
Representative Rothenberger,
Present, I'm sorry.
Representative Scott, Senator Humphreys, Senator McDaniel, Representative Huff, Representative Reed, Representative Rudy, Senator Kerr, Representative Tipton,
Present in person.
Chair Riley.
Here.
Senator Neal is here at home.
Thank you.
All right, this morning we're going to hear from the Department of Education regarding budget cuts that are being made by both KDE and local school districts due to COVID-19's impact on the economy. Both the tangible cuts we know of for fiscal year 20, based on the updated CFG forecast, and the preparation being made for fiscal year 21, because we expect to see a shortfall in fiscal year 21 once receipts begin coming in. Members, please hold your questions until after the presentation. If you're participating remotely, please email me or subcommittee staff with your questions, and we will make sure to check with you again once all questions have been asked by the participants here in room 154. With that said, Robin and Charlie, please identify yourselves for the record and begin your presentation.
Good morning. My name is Robin Kinney. I'm the Associate Commissioner in the Office of Finance and Operations at the Kentucky Department of Education.
And I'm Charlie Harmon. I'm the Budget Director at the Department of Education.
Thank you so much for having us here today. We really appreciate the opportunity to appear before you. We had a pretty extensive invitation and presentation that we did to the Interim Education Committee yesterday. So we are going to narrow our conversations to those that were identified by Chair Riley today. But of course, if you have any questions about anything else, Charlie and I'll do our best to answer. I'm going to turn it over to Charlie first, and he's going to walk us through kind of what's been happening at the Department of Education as we together try to maneuver through the revenue impacts of the coronavirus, what's been happening at the department, our reduction that was requested for this fiscal year, and as we look forward to the next fiscal year, the impact on both the Department of Education and on local school districts.
Thank you, Robin. Good morning, committee. Chair Riley. As the chair mentioned, we had 3 questions that we needed to address. The first question being the current year shortfall for FY20. In general, we had a request for 1% of our general fund budget request. But the good thing about this is SEEK was exempted and school district health insurance was exempted. So we took a 1% on the remainder of our budget, which exempting a $3 billion SEEK program is very great for the Department of Education's local school districts and the school district health insurance. So that helped us a lot. So, but when you're taking such a cut late in the year, it's not 1%, it's kind of 12.5% because we got this request, middle of May. So when we're scrambling around trying to find money, for us, it was just a little over $3 million, which is a lot of money. $3 million is a lot of money. We were very fortunate that we had some savings due to COVID-19. We have around 300 central office Frankfurt-based employees and around 1,000 total because we have a little over 600 in our area technology centers, 53 area technology centers across the state. And we have about a couple hundred at KSB and KSD together. So the positives happened for us where when COVID hit and both of our state schools were closed, all the school districts were closed, we saved some money in operating expenses, just the practical operating expenses that we were very fortunate to have. And we also had some travel. You know, we always have about 100 people on the road a day in our department. And now we're having about one person on the road a day. It's really, our interim Commissioner Brown is taking it very seriously. And we're all working from home, and it's actually working. We're doing a good job for the circumstance we're put under, which benefit, and we're saving a little money in travel and our operating expenses. So we were very fortunate that when we had to take this cut, it was limited to central office and didn't have to affect our state schools, our area technology centers, or local school districts. So that was a really big bonus for us. Although losing $3 million isn't easy, there were things we could have spent that on, for the school districts. But in this case, we didn't have to take personnel cuts or other cuts to affect districts. For FY21, it's just a big giant question mark. The consensus forecast group made official recommendations to revise FY20. They did not take an official action in 21, although they issued new forecasts, and they're not looking good. It looks like we'll be at least 6 months into FY21 before the revenue starts to stabilize. So for KDE proper, we're trying to prepare for that in several ways. One, we've got a list of programs here. We've got standards development, industry certifications, turnaround audits, support for our comprehensive, our schools being CSI, and our school report card. Those are all programs that we have that are going on that are either new or under improvement. Okay, that costs money that we don't really have a specific appropriation for. So we're still trying to scramble to accomplish that. Those are going to be kind of being held on hold for a while, depending on what's going on with state revenues. And always number one on our we don't have any money case is KSB and KSD, the Kentucky School for the Blind in Louisville and the Kentucky School for the Deaf in Danville. Those schools for years have been underfunded, and this is going to be tough for them if we have to take cuts at the state level. They are 100% state funded. They get just a teeny bit of special education money, like $10,000 or something, not very much at all. But those will be directly impacted. It'll be very difficult for those schools because they're already in tight situation. And of course, at the department, we'll take a hard look at staffing if we have problems, and we'll do the best we can not to affect school districts if we have cuts to make in 21, which I definitely think we will, but I don't know the magnitude at this point in time. As we've said over the years, we've had funding issues. We've taken cuts since 07, I think, and we had 1 or 2 good years since then when we had House Bill. I think it was House Bill, the FY17-18 budget. We got a little bit of an increase there, which was really good for the department and school districts. But once again, we had to take cuts in the next one, so it kind of ebbs and flows for us. One thing that's not on the slide, but that we do have a real concern about is local tax revenues as well for school districts. They get a lot of their taxes from their local property taxes and property taxes. Although they're pretty steady, they're definitely not rising at the 2% and 3% rate that we had hoped. And we do have a few districts that get taxes from other employment taxes and a few other inventory taxes. And we do not expect those to increase at all. We expect those to go down. So we're going to take a cut at the state level, probably have to impact school districts, and they're going to be have a revenue shortfall from their local funds too. So it's going to kind of kind of hit them pretty hard. We haven't had significant issues yet, but they're all anticipating it, trying to plan. We've been having weekly or bi-weekly superintendent webinars, and we've been covering everything from staffing to planning to transportation, everything that affects school districts and how we can support them. Robin's got a little bit of good news to talk about on the funding. I don't know how she got that.
I think we'll take any good news.
So I think what Charlie is referencing is the CARES Act funding. That is funding from the federal government. The CARES Act, you've probably heard a lot about in the media because it impacts so many different agencies in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. But the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, I'm really going to focus on two pots of money that are related to education. And if I can just verify that we are on the CARES Act slide. Is that the one that we're on? Okay, because I can't see that from where I'm sitting. Thank you. There are two pots of money that I'm really going to focus on and share with you how we've guided school districts. It's really important that both pots of these money really allow for flexibility for school districts to determine how they best can utilize these funds to meet their community needs. The first one is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, and of course we have to shorten everything with an acronym, so we call that ESSER. ESSER is about $193 million that are coming to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. It is being allocated pursuant to the Title I-A formula. So that is only the kind of the method of distribution that is contained in the CARES Act, and we are directed that that is how districts will receive that allocation. So when people were talking about, and we were trying to prepare districts for planning purposes, we told them that if you think about it, it'll be about 80 to 85% of what you typically receive from your Title I appropriation. That allowed them to kind of be thinking about how much money they might receive. There are broad permissible uses under the ESSER funds. So you can use it for anything that is already permissible and eligible under the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. So that contains all of your title programs that you typically think about. So you can use these dollars for anything under that. Perkins, IDEA for those special population groups, McKinney-Vento that focuses on homeless, and then also a broad category that I would classify as kind of Corona or COVID related type expenditures. So anything that districts are incurring now that they didn't have before as a result of the coronavirus. So additional cleaning that needs to happen, purchase of PPE for both students and staff, anything that is related to coronavirus. Again, very broad, and districts have the ability to kind of determine what that is going to look like. In order to, I will compliment the U.S. Department of Education on the funding for education through the CARES Act, because they made the process as simple as possible. Typically, you know, when we are applying for federal funds, it takes more effort on the part of the department and more time to get it together. I think them understanding the need for expediency in this matter, they did a very simple application for us. It was literally, we were checking boxes. Do you need this? And so I will commend them for making sure that we could get access to funds as quickly as possible. That application has already been approved for ESSER, and we have posted the allocations on our federal grants website through Charlie's office, so that districts can see exactly how much will be coming to them. From the school district side, we wanted to kind of mimic that ease of trying to make sure that it was available and accessible. So what we asked districts to do was to fill out an assurance document. They are very familiar with assurance documents. It's more along the lines of you promise to do X, Y, and Z. And those requirements very much tied to federal requirements that they are used to seeing. We did not require them to go in front of their local boards and seek that approval to apply. But of course, anytime that districts are receiving funds from the federal government or the state, they need to have their local school boards involved and aware of funds that are available to them. So we asked them to make sure that was happening. So as of now, I think we have about 5 districts that have actually have already received funds associated with ESSER. One thing about ESSER and the GEARS money that I'll talk about next is they could go back to expenditures back to March 13th. So March 13th was the date of the National Declaration of Emergency. And so districts started expending dollars that they needed to expend in anticipation of keeping their districts going. And so they can go back to that date for eligible expenditures. And so we've had about 5 districts that have already received funds for about, I think, a little more than $800,000. We have encouraged districts to be thoughtful because, as we know with federal funds, this is a one-time, as far as we know right now. And so they will have lots of expenditures, and they do need to be thoughtful and careful about their planning as it relates to their needs across their school district. The other pot of money, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or GEAR, about $43 million coming to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Of that amount, about $30 million will be allocated to local school districts. The GEARS funding came to the Commonwealth, as it did to other states, with the governor having some discretion on how that would be allocated. And so the $30 million is coming to local school districts. The balance is actually going to the institutes of higher education for other educational purposes. Very appreciative that the governor provided this additional funds for local school districts. And we kind of determined as a Commonwealth, we saw 2 really uprising needs that we continually have heard across our school districts. So GEARS funds, although there is flexibility, we have guided districts to use these funds in 2 kind of large pots. One pot would be for remote learning and technology, because we see so much the need, we believe, to continue to operate in some form or fashion for remote learning for the next school year. We don't really know what that's going to look like yet, but we see that as an ongoing need. Whether districts start that way and continue from a remote learning standpoint or have to go in and out of remote learning, technology, instructional coaches on how we can improve our instruction delivery through remote learning, anything that is broadly related to remote learning would be available, as well as if districts need to continue to improve the numbers of their technology devices. And so very broad uses in the technology area. The other area that GEARS money may be used for is for continuation of needs related to food service. Food service has been really, really important when it comes to continuation of learning for our students. If you see on the national level, we are seeing as a nation unprecedented amounts of people that really need access to food. Our food banks across the country are really being hit by people that have never really had to rely upon that community support for food and nutrition. And so our school districts really have stepped up to the plate in making sure, even in our time of NTI and remote learning, that nutritious meals are continuing to be served. And so we really commend the efforts of our school districts. In March, when we were kind of halfway in and halfway out of our NTI experience, our district served over 4.6 million meals to students in Kentucky. And in April, when we were completely NTI, that rose to over 11 million meals. I mean, you see the impact and the need for us to support nutrition at this very, very critical time. And we're heading into the summer area. Officially, I guess we're in summer now when we talk about school. And even though school has kind of ended for the year, the need for food doesn't stop. And so we continue to encourage, to the extent that districts can do, that they continue to provide that service. And I'm going to pause for just a minute because, and refer to the chair. I see some questions, but would you like me to keep on
Just keep
continuing?
on going. We'll do
Okay.
that. Yes.
Okay. So, these funds will, of course, be available, and districts will have that flexibility. We will ask districts in both of these pots of money to report back to, the department what we are calling a spending plan. It's not a budget, but it is a indication, by June 30th, so they can share with us kind of their, intentions at this point in time on how they would expend their dollars. We think that will be useful as we continue to inform the General Assembly of how districts are looking at this money, and also help us to advocate for additional funds if that's, if that's appropriate as we move forward. We did put on this slide a reference to ERA funds, just to kind of put a little bit of context to what education received here in Kentucky under the ERA funding back in 2009, and you'll see that was an $800 million number as compared to about a $225 million under the CARES Act. So we only put that on there for context purposes, so you can see the efforts that were done back in 2009 as compared to where we are right now for funding from the federal government. Okay, next slide. Now they're somehow out of order. I apologize. The other thing, of course, that we were asked to talk about is to talk about the COVID-19 impact on districts, and as we look forward into the next school year and really continuation of efforts over the summer, we do see increased cost needs that are necessarily going to need to be incurred by districts. Sanitation and cleaning, of course, as we all in our personal lives and our business lives are faced with new requirements for sanitation and cleaning. We're talking about whether that be buildings or buses, high touch areas, when we think of all the things that you touch when you're in a school building as well as in your own personal life. Doors, water fountains, stair rails, desks, all those things being touched by numbers of students if they are in person in the building. And that's an increased frequency that will be needed for that cleaning as well. So increase in the amount of supplies, the time being spent on cleanliness, and the areas that are being touched. Personal protective equipment, PPE, masks, gloves, thermometers for both students and staff. Of course, the recommendation, just as we came here for the meeting today, people are wearing their own masks, and that is very much appreciated. But we know that there will be, if we are conducting in-person instruction, there will be either students or staff that either don't have the availability of a mask for that personal protection, and so districts will be incurring costs to have masks available for their students and their staff. The model of instruction delivery, that's a really big unknown at this point. I think a lot of it is dependent upon, as we get closer to school, what the coronavirus and the impact on the coronavirus is actually yielding at that time. But the issue for local school districts right now is they need to make decisions now. By now, they would have already known exactly what their next school year is going to look like. They would have already known what their budget looks like. They would already have their calendar set. So the department did grant a waiver to extend the ability of local school districts to submit their calendar as late as July 31st, because again, we want to afford that maximum flexibility to school districts but they have to be having those conversations with their communities and with each other right now. I think we've all been in a situation where you think you have a really great plan, and if people don't buy into the plan, then it becomes more difficult, even though you thought it was a really good plan. So we're encouraging local school districts to talk to their communities. We have some that are actually doing surveys of their parents and their staff and their communities to inquire about, what about coming back in person? How do you feel about that? We're going to have a lot of parents that may be reluctant to send their children to school in person. We will also have some parents that are ready to send their kids back to school. So districts are going to have to really prepare for what that looks like. And we have encouraged them to almost develop a playbook. So you may have the best of intentions of starting out one way, and then whether we have a spike in the coronavirus, it may cause you to go to a different type of look. As well as if things get better, you may have a different type of look. So districts are in a very challenging situation, and I think what we are trying to afford them is as much flexibility as possible to make those really hard decisions. And based upon the model of instruction that they choose, whether it's technology, they may need to beef that up. We continue to be concerned about opportunity and access, so that all of our students have the same opportunity and access. We still have students that do not have the same internet capability at their homes. And so we do have many school districts that continue to have to rely upon paper and pencil for instruction of delivery. That is not ideal. It's not the best way to do it, but we do have districts in that situation. So increased costs for delivering preparation of those packets and materials that need to go out the door. Transportation, really big, important issue for local school districts. They rely upon the ability to transport students to even have in-person instruction. And we were actually on a superintendent's call yesterday talking with the Department for Public Health. Our relationship with the Department of Public Health has become very close over the last month or so, as we are trying to find a balance in making sure that we can continue to deliver instruction in the best way possible, but still being respectful of the difficult situation public health finds us all in, and the guidance that they have to deliver to us. So we are constantly talking to each other about how can we do this safely? How can we mitigate risk? I think as opening any environment to numbers of people, whether it be our schools or our businesses or anywhere else, we will continue to have people that get sick. And so that's just a reality, just like in the school districts. And I don't want to make a pure comparison to the flu, but we do have, students that come to school and kids that get sick at school during the flu season. And so we will have this, but how do we find that balance to make sure that we can really conduct that instruction in the best way possible, but being respectful of the public health needs. And of course, implementing effective social distancing. We talk about that a lot. We're all conducting ourselves in that manner today, and so the operational needs of a school district, just logistically to make that happen, is very difficult. We talk about classrooms and the number of kids we typically see in a classroom and how close desks are together. And now, we need to move to a different type of look. Less children in the classroom, desks further apart. How does that work? Do we have enough space? Really difficult planning decisions. We talked a little bit about food service, and I only want to mention again, it's not on the slide, but the food service costs associated with food service, the way the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is where school districts receive their funding reimbursement for food, is based upon a premise of the number of meals and then a rate associated with it. So it's not a reimbursement for actual expenditures. So I think that's really important for us to all be aware of, because when you're talking about a breakfast amount of $2 and something and a lunch amount of $3 and something, and the number of students that you're trying to feed under a remote model, you may have additional expenses associated with that. Many districts utilize their bus drivers and their buses to deliver meals to get to those students. And while those costs are eligible costs, we can use our food service money to reimburse that. It's an extra cost, and the rate of reimbursement stayed the same. So we've got districts who perform very, very admirably, but they're going to have an expended amount. They're going to have amounts that are not reimbursed under that. So that's a good part of the CARES Act and being able to utilize that. It remains to be seen if it will be enough, because if we keep on keeping on and we have to use this model, to deliver our instruction, it becomes challenging. Charlie had mentioned that we do provide a lot of guidance to local school districts. Every Tuesday for 2 hours, we conduct a superintendent's webcast, and all superintendents, and we've had finance officers on there periodically as well, because the importance of the funding decisions that need to be made. Those happen every Tuesday for 2 hours. We also have an education task force that is put together, that the commissioner put together. These are sort of like our interested partners, all of the K groups that we rely upon, as well as educational cooperatives, the Center for School Safety, KHSAA, all of those types of partners that are really interested in school districts and the operations of school districts. So we meet with them very regularly. Those are every other week now. And the other group that the commissioner has engaged as far as frequency of timing, kind of pick that up a little bit, is the Superintendent's Advisory Council. And so the weeks that the Education Task Force is not meeting, then we'll have Superintendent's Advisory Council meeting. I've also mentioned the Department for Public Health, and we've had them on a couple of our superintendent's webcasts because districts are really seeking that clarity about what are the, I will say, the minimums to get us back into the door, and then the rest of the guidance on best practices or other opportunities really to continue to mitigate the risk. And so we've worked very closely with them. The other areas that we continue to provide guidance and seek input from are our advisory councils. And so we have several advisory councils that it's really important to hear their voice. That's, we have a special ed advisory council, always trying to think of the unique needs of that population. A parents advisory council, talking to parents and families, and a student advisory council. We've learned so much from our student advisory council. Really specifically, I would say some of the things that they bring to the table is their unique perspective as a student during this time, and how people are faring, their classmates and peers on the social and emotional front. And we see that as a huge need going forward. You know, everyone's going to come back to school, whatever that looks like, with a very different perspective. And we continue to have our counselor, Dr. Damian Sweeney, supporting those efforts. I think the only other thing that, you know, it's sort of like, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and I would share with you a little bit about SEEK. You know, districts are very interested at this point in time, really, about all the funding that is going to be available. And I would extend my appreciation to the General Assembly with Senate Bill 177, which really allowed us to get through the last school year as best we could. And part of that is the allowance of really giving flexibility for additional NTI days, which was needed and we expect will be needed in the future. And then the other part is trying to kind of grapple with that attendance issue and funding to kind of close out the year. Because as we look forward, as many of you know, SEEK is funded on a look back. So we look back to the year before when we're talking about attendance and what happened with the attendance and all the other things, transportation and special ed populations, home hospital, all those subcategories. So we are always looking a year back when we're determining the amounts for the next school year. And as we got to the end of this school year, of course, we realized our attendance was going to look crazy, first of all. And our statutes right now are really designed under this thought that we're going to be in person in a seat in a school building most of the time. It's based upon attendance, either a half day or a full day. And we can come up with an average daily attendance fairly easily that way. When we go to an NTI instruction, you know, we don't have that in-person child sitting in a seat. And so that's one of the things that we're grappling with. But what the General Assembly did with Senate Bill 177 last year, which allowed us to really have a little level of certainty for funding for this year, was you all passed legislation that said, okay, we know the end of the school year is upside down right now, and you gave districts the flexibility of saying, I'm either gonna look at my data from the previous year, or if I need to, we'll work with the department and use it for this year that we're finishing. And most districts, we've had all districts reply to us about what data that they wanted to use, and we had 14 districts that chose to use this school year's data, finishing out this school year, and use that data for their funding for next year. The rest of them, out of our 172 districts, chose to use the more certainty of that last year data, the 18-19 data. So that really helped us at the department to be able to kind of know what data we were looking at, and allowed us, as we move forward, to give a little bit of predictability for the school year upcoming. Of course, that is to say, before, as Charlie mentioned, if we get into any budget reductions, of course, that adds a whole nother level of complexity on top of it. But at least it gives districts a little bit of predictability, I would say, for this school year. So let's fast forward to as we start the new school year. As we start the new school year, we have even a higher level of unpredictability of what school's gonna look like. We have it for a longer period of time. We're gonna have it likely for the whole school year. And so when you talk, we are already looking forward to the next year's funding. You know, what would that look like? And so we are having those discussions. We are having, seeking input and feedback from our local school districts and finance officers, because again, they know what's happening for this school year, but we're already looking to the next one. So we will continue those discussions and keep you informed of decisions that, or kind of guidance that we're issuing for the next school year. And then finally, to Charlie's point about revenue, you know, when we talk about collections for local school districts, of course, all of you are very aware of the consensus forecasting group and thinking about, you know, it's not going to look the way we all thought. One thing I would urge us to keep in mind when it comes to local school districts, in addition to just that level of funding, is collections. Collections, so important in local school districts. And I hate to reflect back to the issue that we had not too long ago about unmined coal. And, you know, that was something that happened in the middle of the year, and, you know, we were trying to all react to that. But reductions in local revenues and what that looks like, it's really hard for districts to respond to very quickly. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I would be concerned about what level of collections. We have unprecedented numbers of unemployment, people that even though they want to pay, they just may not be able to pay. So I think that's another thing that we just need to collectively keep on our horizon as we think about what the next year might look like. I think that ends my prepared remarks, and we are happy to try to answer any questions, Chair Riley.
Thank you, Rob and Charlie, for your presentation. I don't envy you, and everyone else in the state has to make decisions regarding a lot of issues, and primarily the one we're talking about today, education. For those members with questions, we'll take questions from the members here in the room first. And I think right now we have Senator Embry has a question.
Yes. I have a county in my district, Muhlenberg County, that was hard hit by the decline of the coal industry. They had to release, had to cut salaries or release some staff. Now, their main source of income was from TVA, and they have lost the majority of those funds, which means that will affect their budget by 13%. 13% is devastating to their budget. I don't know, they're looking at more staff actions, maybe even closing a school, combining it with another one, which would be hard to do with social distancing and so forth. And they have already taken efforts to raise other revenue, and at this time with so many people out of work and businesses closed, it's hard to take more money on the local level, so they're really up against it. I assume, of course, you communicated these two sources, state and federal, to all the school districts. They would be eligible to try to use some of those funds to help them, is that right?
They absolutely can use those funds for the eligible purposes. Of course, by using those funds in the areas that are eligible, that may free up money for them from another source to be able to address some of those concerns. You're absolutely right. Reductions overall, and for some school districts, we've seen loss in enrollment as well, and so that always impacts their revenues as well. So a very difficult time for school districts right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Tipton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a lot of notes and a lot of questions, but I'll try and condense them as best possible. Robin, Charles, appreciate you being here today. You're all in a difficult position like all of us are. A couple of questions on the ESSER funds. Two-part question. When will the school districts actually receive those dollars at the local level? And could you refer back to that website that we could go back and look at the actual distribution to each school district?
Sure. Charlie can send the actual location of the web link to Chuck and make sure that we get it distributed to all your membership.
Thank you.
As far as when they can access, federal funds, typically you expend your dollars and then you ask for a federal cash reimbursement. So for the ESSER funds, that process is already available and open. If you are a district that had already expended some dollars that are permissible for expenditure under ESSER, then we have already received some of those federal cash requests. So we have 5 districts that have actually received funds already. So they just need to make that federal cash request and we turn that around. So those funds are available. For the Gears Fund, which is the smaller pot of money, we're still working through a few things. Those come into the cabinet itself, and then the cabinet actually makes it available because it's going to 2 different places. It's going some to the Department of Education to disperse to districts, and the rest is going to the Institutes of Higher Education. So they are in the process of setting up the account so that we can access those very quickly too.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, a follow-up additional question, please. And this deals with the issue of local tax revenues, local revenues. I think you're absolutely right. We're going to see delayed payments on property tax. We're probably going to see more delinquent property taxes. It's going to be an issue for every taxing entity out here. You mentioned you project like to see a 2 to 3% increase. I know there is a big difference in school taxing rates. Some ask for the 4%. Some.
Yeah.
Could you all just let us? Is there a way we can find out just what each local school district has done in regard to taking the 4% compensating the last few years, just so we have an idea what local school districts are doing?
Absolutely. We take those in front of the Kentucky Board of Education, the tax rates that each district does. So we have even historical information back maybe 10 years that we can make available to you. We'll make that available also to Chuck. So you can see what your individual districts have done over the years, whether it's compensating or 4% or other, or but we certainly have that information and can make it available.
One more, I'll make it my last.
We will indulge you one more time.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Co-Chairman, I'll remember you next month when you have a bunch of questions. Talking about our funding model. Of course, we've had to make some adjustments. I've heard a lot of people ask the question, is it time for us to take a hard look and evaluate our funding model for school funding? Is it time for us to look into that? Because I know most people probably couldn't even explain the SEEK formula to you.
Yeah.
Is it time for us maybe to take a hard look at that, and especially in light of this changing world that we're in and how we fund local school districts?
I think it is time to take a look from the perspective of, it's always good to look at anything that's been around for a while. And SEEK, our model, has had very few changes to it over the years. I do say, as we reach out to other states, and certainly not in this environment that we're in right now. But we continue to receive kind of comments from other states that we have the right components to seek. The things we're looking at are things that should be included. I would never encourage us to make very drastic changes during a pandemic, but I think it is time for us to think about different ways to address it for the future. It is a complicated formula. I even think of myself as a continuing learning scholar of SEEK. Every day I learn something new about it. There are very few that really, really understand and appreciate all the intricacies of SEEK. We are very lucky that we have a few of those at the department. But I think it is always fair to look at anything that's been around for a significant period of time.
Thank you, sir. Representative Bojanowski.
Thank you. So my question has to do with a couple of articles I've read by discussing Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's intent on some of the CARES Act money to be appropriated to private schools. I'm referring specifically to an article in the New York Times on May 15th that stated that she directed school districts to share millions of dollars designated for low-income students with wealthy private schools. So my question is do we have to pay any percentage of our dollars that we receive to private schools? What percentage would it be, and or was our amount available reduced because of any payments to private schools?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. So the letter that the representative is referring to really concerns equitable services. And equitable services and the provision of equitable services is required in many federal programs. Under the CARES Act, the way equitable services, and they have said equitable services does apply. So that kind of general concept of equitable services does apply. That does not mean that money goes to private schools. But there is and this is almost as complicated as SEEK, so I'm not going to get into the details because I'm not the person to really define what that looks like. But there is a model that our continuous improvement and support office at the Department of Education actually informs districts, and they work with them on equitable services and what that must look like. But again, it doesn't mean money, it means the value of services. So that is required under the CARES Act funding. There has been, some states have taken the position and have asked, we would rather not do equitable services under the CARES Act. And the other part about the CARES Act that is a little different in this circumstance is districts go through this process once a year, and they've already gone through this process for this year for equitable services. And the CARES Act and the position of USED is you have to reopen it for the CARES Act money. So you may have other private schools that typically don't participate and don't seek assistance under equitable services for the year.